Hello, everyone. I'm Shelley Rosenblum, Curator of Academic Programs at the Morrison Helen Belkin Art Gallery. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I've been having ginger tea all day, hoping I can still speak with you, so forgive me for my funny voice. At the Belkin, we acknowledge that we work on the traditional homelands of the Musqueam people who have cared for this land always and whose relationships to this place endure. The continued violations of sovereignty, territory, and waterways are the ongoing manifestations of colonialism that we benefit from and must work to transform. As a cultural institution situated within a university, we commit to learning, listening, acting, and being in relationship to Indigenous communities and cultural life. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to Difficult Kinship, a symposium developed in conjunction with our current exhibition, That Directionless Light of the Future, Rediscovering Russell FitzGerald. This is an exhibition with grapples with a difficult and overlooked figure, exploring how the most idiosyncratic artists can crack open familiar historical narratives. Russell FitzGerald was a complex, confounding figure. No one knew what to make of his ambitious, figurative, literary, and mystical works, which defy easy categorization. Made in San Francisco in the late 50s, Pennsylvania and New York in the 60s, Vancouver in the 70s, it is miraculous that any FitzGerald survived at all, says guest curator Jon Davies. The artist struggled with addiction and died tragically young at age 45. Jon Davies, exhibition guest curator, situates these rarely seen works by American artist and writer Russell FitzGerald with works by his contemporaries, largely from the Bay Area, to explore how secret and subcultural knowledge complicates archiving and transmission. The context is a varied community of artists with an a priori understanding of the life of the artist as a holistic and multidisciplinary practice. In mid-century America, avant-garde and alternative poetry was considered subversive, dangerous, and hostile. To write published poems about drugs and sexuality, or poems with anti-nationalist, anti-war sentiment, was to attract suspicion from the authorities. It may have even landed you in prison, as many of the poets from this cohort were arrested on obscenity charges. Predictably, such subversive writing was often rejected by mainstream publishers, the result being that a lot of great poets and their work fell into obscurity, much like FitzGerald and his paintings. Russell FitzGerald and the others represented in the exhibition, Spicer, Duncan, Blazer, Kaufman, Delaney, Hacker, Adam, were linked by a shared disillusionment with the hierarchies of the literary and artistic establishment. Spicer, for instance, belonged to the beat-adjacent San Francisco Renaissance, where he presided over an experimental reading group named the Dharma Committee, which, fueled by narcotics, attracted the attention of the FBI. Bob Kaufman was part of an emerging set of peripatetic poets who vagabonded between different artistic spheres. One important historical context here, of course, is the Lavender Scare, a moral panic which made homosexuality metonymic with national security threat. To be queer was to be mentally ill, deviant, perverted. To be queer was to be a literal and figurative outlaw. In this sense, they lived lives of precarity, nonconformity, their day-to-day tinctured by a psychic terrorism nearly impossible to imagine. And I quote the poet John Wieners, who wrote in prose poem, "We exist upon the fringe of the world, small, bright fragments that somehow burn away at the fire's edge. It is tempting, though reductive, to see their fates as resulting solely from this marginality. As we know, the details of their lives confront us with the ravages of alcoholism and heroin addiction, incarcerations in psychiatric hospitals and prisons. These works often spotlight the connection between art and affliction, but challenge us to consider creative expression as a very real mode of survival and salvation, and not merely, as current wellness discourses suggest, a potential curative or preventive to mental ill health." So with that, we invite you to join us in an experiment today in thinking about this exhibition together, to consider the different contextual forces at play, from mysticism and intoxication to poetry and queer bohemian networks, to Harlem jazz and the long history of America's racial fantasies. We are interested in performing the pedagogical model of speculation and unknowing, and to consider, to quote queer historian Jennifer Evans, the value of anti-heroic bad kid and difficult kinship in our current moment. To recover artists from the past whose unimaginable nonconformity contributed to the contemporary obscurity is a necessary task. How we read them now, particularly if we hope their work might help us navigate our own precarious present, is more complex. Perhaps the challenge is to do so with care and without sentimentality. And that is what we hope to do here today. So I'm going to very briefly introduce our speakers today on the panel in alphabetical order. Then the structure of the day is that each of the speakers will present for around 20 minutes or so, followed by a conversation among the panelists, and then we'll open up the conversation to the group, and you're welcome to participate in that way. Jon Davies is a Montreal-based curator, writer, and scholar. Davies has worked as assistant curator at the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery, associate curator at Oakville Galleries, and curated independent projects. His writing on film, video, and contemporary art has been widely published. He's the author of Trash, a queer film classic, Bristol Pulp Press in 2009, the editor of Colin Campbell, More Voiceover, Concordia UP in 2021. He recently received his PhD in art history from Stanford, and his dissertation is titled The Fountain, Art, Sex, and Queer Pedagogy in San Francisco, 1945 to 95, which has been invaluable for all of us in thinking about the work in the exhibition. Thank you, Jon. Nalo Hopkinson, welcome, is professor of creative writing at UBC. She writes science fiction and fantasy, exploring the potential for centering non-normative voices and experiences. She has published 6 novels and numerous short stories, and edited and co-edited many anthologies. Her writing has received, and I'll read some of the awards, the John W. Campbell Award, Locus Magazine's Best First Novel Award, the Sunburst Award for Canadian Literature of the Fantastic, the World Fantasy Award, the Andre Norton Nebula Award, the Inkpot Award, the Octavia E. Butler Memorial Award. Look all those up, or did I give them to you? Canada's Prix Aurora Award, and the Science Fiction Writers of America Damon Knight Memorial Grandmaster Award. Welcome, Jamie. Thanks for coming so far. This is a short visit. Jamie Parra is Assistant Professor of English at Skidmore College. His writing has appeared in such selected journals as J19, Novel, ALH, American Literary History. He is currently writing a book entitled Skywater about slavery, visual culture, and literary form in 19th century US literature. Please join me in a warm welcome for our speakers today. So I'd like to invite Jon first.
Thank you so much for that introduction. There's so much in there to unpack. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. So this is the artist Russell FitzGerald, who I would describe as a largely unknown, romantic, mid-century American figurative painter who pursued art as a spiritual calling despite very little professional recognition during his lifetime. Art, sex, religion intertwined in allegorical paintings, drawing on history, myth, Catholic iconography. He committed to examining his desire for Black men and to understanding the historical forces that prevented the communion between Black and white in the United States. He elaborated a complex spiritual, aesthetic, racial cosmology spanning the late 1950s to the late 1970s. And he's very kind of hidden in the exhibition. There aren't any, there's very few self-portraits, and when there are figures who kind of stand in for him, but this is a photograph of him that was taken by his friend Raymond Taylor on May 13th, 1970, right before he left New York City for Vancouver under quite traumatic circumstances, I would say. But it was quite a beautiful photo shoot because the cameras passed back and forth between FitzGerald and Taylor, and they photographed each other with these plants and glass orbs around them. So FitzGerald died at age 45 in 1978, and his widow Dora FitzGerald, born Dora Gessler, donated all the works to the Belkin over the years. So when I received an invitation to propose an exhibition from the Belkin's collection, I was very excited to dive into this material. I was familiar a little bit with FitzGerald based on my research into this very queer painting and poetry scene in San Francisco in the 1950s. And I'm very interested in history and its kind of challenging difference from the present. I think history has a right to its kind of alienness and its otherness, and it forces us to sit with real difference and disquiet. So the exhibition really tries to map his life and work and ideas and the different social scenes and artistic conversations he was a part of. And when we pulled all this work out of storage and organized it, I was really struck by how all the archival research that I'd done, learning about him, that I'd done before, was really just the beginning. And in some ways, the harder thinking kind of began when the show opened to the public in September. So I feel like there's still so much to do, and I'm excited to do that together with you today. So FitzGerald designed his own tarot deck, which we included in the exhibition. And I thought it could be useful to think about today because every card has one meaning when oriented right side up, then another one upside down. And he noted that this card, the sun, signifies happiness when facing upright and less so when reversed. So not unhappiness, but just less happiness. The card itself figures a duality in its depiction of two intertwined men, one black and one white, their faces turned away from us. And the great science fiction writer Samuel Delany, a close friend of the artist, told me it's hard to tell whether they're in an embrace or whether they're tearing each other to pieces. FitzGerald rendered his tarot deck in black and white, and in fact his whole worldview was shaped by this kind of duality of light and dark that originated in his Catholic upbringing. But I would say his spiritual quest and embrace of mysticism over the course of his life, he ultimately sought to kind of transcend this dualistic way of thinking, which I think is also something we're trying to do here today. So the idea for today's symposium came from the Carleton University historian Jennifer V. Evans' book, The Queer Art of History, where she argues in favor of trying to understand historical figures in their full complexity through a lens she calls queer kinship, rather than whitewashing or tidying them up to better reflect our present day identities and political beliefs. And I would say, I feel like there's a way that we look to historical figures to turn them into icons and heroes, and I feel like a lot is lost in that process. A lot is, we kind of shape them to fit our own needs. So she writes, a focus on kinship exposes the power and contradictions of queerness, not as an identity category, but as a set of relations produced by and through shifting and unequal dynamics of power. And rather than embrace a linear model of increasing progress and freedom, she looks to, quote, unanticipated alliances, bad gays, monstrous others, and imperfect heroes. And I think this nicely captures what I was hoping to do with this exhibition, which is really based in these urban subcultural scenes where I would say queerness was lived improvisationally and kind of invented in practice. And these bohemian communities valued risk-taking, ecstatic, and even self-shattering experiences, whether through mystic or spiritual pursuits or through drugs and alcohol, and who eroticized rather than papered over difference and sought out cross-class and cross-race contact as a way of learning and kind of expanding horizons. Whereas today, I feel like we are quite risk averse and see the world primarily through a lens of potential harm and are much more concerned with security and comfort. Evans draws on Michel Foucault, noting how, quote, the sexual politics of experimentation, fluidity, and flux has given way to one of recognition in which identity becomes the law, the principle, the code of one's existence. Suddenly one's place in the world today is secured by a past that confirms how we got here. So I think the very queer San Francisco painting and poetry scene around poet Jack Spicer that FitzGerald was a part of in the late 1950s is just very appealing to me, partly for its disdain for money in the art market as well as publicity. They understood art as a sacred and spiritual pursuit that was more based on intuition and in fact on artistic inspiration kind of coming from the outside, like a transmission from beyond. I appreciate their rejection of mainstream society and its mores, especially around sexuality. And it was also very much a scene where there's an immense romanticization of Black men and Black masculinity, often by white heterosexual men. And want to understand how FitzGerald's queer desirous gaze may be able to tell us something different or something new. So I want to quickly highlight in my remarks two works that I would say mirror each other and are about two of FitzGerald's key relationships with Black male muses, Bob Kaufman and Harold Reynolds. So when FitzGerald moved to San Francisco in the late 1950s, when he was in his early 20s, he quickly fell in with Jack Spicer and then soon after met the early Black beat poet Bob Kaufman. And FitzGerald was completely fascinated and in love with Kaufman. He saw him as, quote, a living poem. And FitzGerald was very much a religious painter, and in this work called 14 Stations of the Cross, he depicted Kaufman as Christ reenacting the Stations of the Cross, so the pictorial program from Western art history that is focused on the stages of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And it's set in a bar called The Place that was really like a mixing ground for mixed sexuality, mixed class, gays and lesbians, dock workers, everyone at poets all went to The Place. And I think I think what's most striking about this work, I'll just run through some of the images. Kaufman was indeed a kind of martyr. He was constantly hassled by the police for reciting his poems on the streets and regularly thrown in jail. Bohemians all behaved badly, but white youth were not hounded by the authorities or criminalized to the same degree as their Black compatriots. In an act of withdrawal, he later undertook a 10-year vow of silence following the 1963 assassination of John F. Kennedy. And Kaufman once told an editor, "I want to be anonymous. My ambition is to be completely forgotten." So FitzGerald's painting cycle recognizes the persecution of his friend by turning it into a sacred event. It also perversely acts as a monument to somebody who wanted to disappear. But somehow it embodies both his love for Christ and for Kaufman merged in a singular series. And what I found to be particularly fascinating is that Kaufman's own poems flirt with this identification with Christ through suffering, such as in his poem Benediction, where he writes, "America, I forgive you, nailing black Jesus to an imported cross every 6 weeks in Dawson, Georgia. America, I forgive you, I forgive you. Eating black children, I know your hunger. America, I forgive you, I forgive you. I found the film The Flower Thief by Ron Rice, which was shot in the North Beach neighborhood of San Francisco. That was kind of the center of the scene in 1960. And in it we see Kaufman again as Christ, carrying a cross, and with a group of mostly white friends erecting this cross, which becomes a gallows and becomes the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima, based on the iconic photo by Joe Rosenthal. And in that last still from the film, you could see Kaufman wearing a crown of thorns and speaking on the telephone. FitzGerald's greatest love during his time in New York City was a man named Harold Reynolds, whose verite style writing about his life as a hustler was published by FitzGerald and friends in the literary magazine called City. And Reynolds first surfaces in FitzGerald's diaries in 1965 and acted as a muse for several works over the following 5 years. Their intense relationship was exacerbated by shooting up heroin together. Frequently incarcerated, Reynolds left very little behind in the archive, but FitzGerald wrote to him and sent him money in 1969 and 1970 when he was in the notorious Bayview Rehabilitation Center for Addicts, which was part of then Governor Nelson Rockefeller's crackdown on heroin use and trafficking. And largely what we know of Reynolds is filtered through FitzGerald's love for him, including a few poems written to him in his journal. One reads, "The Black Prince lies well and steals with discretion and style, but who cares when the sound of his key in a lock raises the midnight sun?" And the work on the left is a study for painting, and it captures the fragility of a number of the FitzGerald works in the Balkans holdings. It's probably the one that's in the most precarious condition. And I think Russell and Dora really lived a very precarious and often destitute existence. The fact that these works traveled between San Francisco to New York to Vancouver and survived and were saved by Dora is quite remarkable. And so we wanted to kind of highlight just the fragility of this work. And then Russell and Dora left New York when Harold was imprisoned to go to Vancouver, and for Russell to kick his heroin habit in Vancouver, and it was kind of a very traumatic kind of rupture, and he spent all of his time in Vancouver longing for Harold and for the other men that he was friends with and involved with in New York. I'm just going to show a few stage designs from a rhythm and blues opera called Sabas that FitzGerald wrote in 1966, inspired by the Saint Sebastian story, and specifically the adaptation by Gabriele D'Annunzio and Claude Debussy. And the play would have starred Harold Reynolds as a Black police officer and playing the role of Saint Sebastian, who was martyred by being pierced by arrows. And it unfolds as a kind of pageant in a tenement backyard in Harlem. And the play included this motif that appears a lot in FitzGerald's work of the Union and Confederate flags from the Civil War kind of intertwining, and at one point they wrap around Sabus, the lead figure. And we weren't able to include these sketches in the exhibition, but I wanted to share them here. And Sabus was never staged, so we can only speculate about how black and white audiences alike would have reacted to this white playwright stylizing themes of lynching and these post-Civil War, very painful legacies of racism in the United States. And the letters from Reynolds and from other men that FitzGerald was involved with in New York provide a really valuable counterpoint to FitzGerald's 600 pages of journals and writing, and they're really kind of processing his desire for them and their relationships through these letters. And a number of the men ended up in prison, including a man named Eugene Smith, writing from Attica. And he says, I want to consider you as a friend, but I distrust the white race. And then later he asks, are you a friend or are you instead an archaeologist? I'm just going to skip ahead a bit to keep within my time. The Saint Sebastian story ends up making sense considering his and Harold's addiction to heroin, and some of the work really explicitly stylizes and depicts their needles and use of heroin. I want to spend a moment just speaking about Dora FitzGerald. Dora as breadwinner and savior, enduring neglect, but also persevering, writing very powerful mourning poems after FitzGerald's death. She lives on Galliano Island. She's 90 years old, and she essentially had a kind of second life after FitzGerald passed away in 1978. She preserved all of the work. She donated it to the Balkan, and she was very much a kind of spiritual and aesthetic partner, sharing conversations about poetry, classical music, great love of gardening and of nature. And FitzGerald, for her birthday one year, his gift to her was changing his signature that he used on his paintings to a kind of sigil that combined both of their initials. So there's very few representations of Dora, but then there is this kind of acknowledgement or like symbol that captures her presence and her work as, breadwinner and creating the material conditions for him to paint. And FitzGerald, his last major work was called Blueprint for Bone. And he'd been reading a German mystic and philosopher named Jacob Boehme, who understood that God lay in the kind of transcending or shattering of binaries. And so I feel like he finally kind of reached a place where he wasn't thinking in black and white anymore. And I think this work ends up being this kind of culmination of his kind of spiritual quest, and there is a certain horizontality or reciprocity of this cosmic swirl of black and white bodies. And I want to end by saying that I was thinking of titling this presentation Fantasies of Reciprocity, and thinking both of FitzGerald kind of trying to imagine more equitable relationships between black and white men, but also my own desires to read this reciprocity or the traces or seeds of racial justice in this work and how I approach the project. And I don't know if fantasies is precisely the right word, but I'm going to stick with that for now. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing our other speakers, and thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much for that, John. I also want to thank Shelley, Nalo, Karen, and Mikkel for making this video possible. I was so struck by John's beautiful and brilliant curatorial essay, which I hope you'll all read if you haven't already, that I decided to frame my remarks as a response. And what I think I'm kind of doing here is more or less just sort of thinking through John's thinking kind of in my own terms. In his essay, John begins with the discussion of the Sun card from FitzGerald's tarot deck, and quotes FitzGerald's friend and collaborator, the eminent Samuel Delany, as saying, "It's hard to tell whether they are in an embrace or whether they're tearing each other to pieces." More than just holding an embrace, the two men are entangled, truly intertwined, as John put it, and as he put it just now. The black figure's ankle is pressed into the bend of the white figure's knee. The black figure's hand grasps the other figure's foot, pulling it in, bending the white man's knee so that his grasp also traps his own foot in the crook of the other's leg. And as John notes, an arm reaches over a back to either inflict or staunch deep lacerations. This card, along with John and Delany's reading of it, leads me to wonder about the difference between embracing the other and tearing them to pieces, and whether there is a difference at all. FitzGerald thought of this card as, and this quote is another discovery of John's, quote, the idea of irreconcilables embracing instead of annihilating each other and themselves by and in the sacrifice, including immolation and consumption of love. I had to read this quote several times before I realized that FitzGerald is saying that the embrace depicted in the card is emphatically not a representation of love. Because love, in his view, is annihilating of oneself and of the other. Of course, this is quite different from how we usually speak of love. Most obviously because the dominant theories hold that it entails not only an invitation and openness to the other, but an openness to alterity itself. In loving someone, I supposedly love all that is different from myself and beyond my control, and I want my beloved, in all their uncontrollable difference, to freely give themselves to me. Their distinctness and separateness must be respected. I'm not really loving someone, many would say, if I want them to change who they are, or if I feel compelled to manipulate them into staying with me. How many times have you said something like this to a friend tormented by an asymmetrical love affair? However, this is not what love means to FitzGerald. For him, love entails a loss of self and a consumption of the other. It is a sacrifice, in the sense that it isn't clear who is doing the loving and what exactly is being loved. Neither figure on the card has a face. They are mere figures, not really figures for or of people. Each of them is no one in particular. FitzGerald's view of love looks and sounds more like the account offered by psychoanalysis. Every love, Freud says, can be traced back to infancy. I don't love the otherness of the beloved. I love something else from the past that I transfer onto them, oneself or a parent. Lacan put it bluntly, I love only my body even when I transfer this love onto the body of the other. That is why love is an annihilation. I take FitzGerald's work to be saying that in order to actually cherish each other's difference, we must set aside what Leo Bersani and Adam Phillips call the myth of love and come up with something new. The embrace of the irreconcilable difference. FitzGerald is trying to find his way to a mode of relating that can truly hold the difference of the other, their unassimilable not me-ness. The hand that inflicts or touches the wound tells us something about the pain that we are fleeing when we relay the myth of love. The myth obscures the reality that being with the other and honoring their difference means that wounds will be inflicted, old wounds will be touched, pain will be felt. The earliest versions of the Sun card from the 15th century until the 20th century often contain two figures holding hands in a garden. It was only in the famed 1909 Rider-Waite deck that the image changed. In the Rider deck Sun card, there is only one figure riding a horse out of a garden. FitzGerald goes backward. He restores the two human bodies to the Sun card, but they no longer hold hands. Instead, they clutch and claw each other. I want to suggest that we do best to avoid mythic love when it comes to queer figures. Exalting them doesn't just run the risk of being disappointed and obscuring their complexity, it in fact annihilates them. This is the difficult problem that FitzGerald was trying to work out in his representation of Black masculine bodies. He knew that he ran the risk of fetishism. Quote, if one race of men is, and this is also from Jon's essay, but it's from FitzGerald's journal, of course. If one race of men is allowed all the economic power, it is curious how their masculinity drains into those men who are denied power. Both races of men, carrying their unsatisfactory portion, find each other frighteningly attractive. The phrase continues to be really interesting to me. They sense each his own fulfillment in the role of the other. The sexual discharge may be as much a sidetracking as violence. What is really needed is an exchange of gifts. How? The problem is the possessive wanting that comes from a feeling of deficiency. And I think, if you go to see the show, that a lot of this thinking probably partly comes through FitzGerald's interest in James Baldwin. As Jon rightly points out, FitzGerald knew well that he was ethically obligated to try to find his way out of the white obsession with Black virility. This is a kind of attraction that hinges on an idealization. And the problem with idealization, as an analyst once said to me, is that every idealized object will eventually become persecutory. That is, idealization cannot be sustained for too long before the subject finds herself at odds with the idealized object. Once you have installed an object atop a pedestal, it won't be too long before it starts making you feel shame about your situation down on the ground. The subject engages in a kind of competition with the idealized individual, a competition that she's always going to lose because the object has something that she wants. The attraction of idealization is not an embrace. It will inevitably lead to, in Bersani and Phillips's phrase, a murderous antagonism. The other has something that I want, and their having it becomes a threat, becomes intolerable. What I'm trying to suggest is that FitzGerald doesn't just present us with a case study of bad kinship. He provides us with some important resources for thinking about this problem of good and bad, good versus bad kinship. The problem of idealizing certain queers, of idealizing certain kinds of bodies, of desires, while condemning others as unworthy of our regard. How do we get out of this kind of splitting between the purely good and purely bad? There is no way out of judgment. And this might be the one place where I disagree with the very end of Jon's essay. But can we find a way of judging that is less polarized between the benevolent and the demonic? Can we practice judgment with less finality, less idealization, and condemnation? The work of ethics, the philosopher Levinas teaches us, is never complete. Its failures, which are constant and inevitable, require redress, but that redress never reaches an endpoint. To go back to Blueprint for Bohm, FitzGerald produced a printed work that could go on infinitely. What interests me most about his chosen process is the fact that, unlike many other print processes he could have chosen for this work, there is no reversal involved in blueprinting. At no point in the process does the writing on the ribbons, for example, the writing that swirls in and out of the image's eddies, appear as a mirror image of itself. So, as the process reverses color, and you saw on John's slide the sort of the white, the mostly white version, here the mostly black version. So as the process reverses color, white becoming black and vice versa, the text from the German mystic that inspired the work remains legible without any of the strenuous mental gymnastics required when you look at a printing plate and try to decipher what it says from the other side of the image. This strikes me as a theory of language, a theory of translation perhaps, and a theory of vision. The print scholar Jennifer Roberts has recently written that, quote, a reverse text, so when you're looking at that thing, like, you know, when you're looking at the printing plate and the text is backwards, a reverse text is suspended on a veil between different parts of a social body, provides a shared plane of communication and an opportunity for dialogue, but does not assume or demand that both sides share precisely the same perspective, end quote. What about when the text is not reversed? When, as in a blueprint, the colors swap places, but the orientation of the image and the text do not? Amidst the chromatic reversal, the orientation of the bodies and the language remain constant. The piece maintains its threads of sameness infinitely, even as difference continues inevitably to transform the piece. FitzGerald's last work enacts a rearrangement of difference and sameness. They do not sit opposed to one another in this piece. Instead, they are counterposed. The sameness becomes the condition of possibility for difference, and the inverse is true too. Through form and process, FitzGerald found a way to hold difference, to honor it without lapsing into an easy and shallow relativism. Nor did he retreat into universalism. Black and white, the colors and the process of racialization still exist. There's also an assumption that language, in spite of its imperfection and in spite of the gulf produced by translation, provides a shared plane of communication that literally weaves in and around the other bodies of the world. Yet language isn't where we meet in the work. It is where we agree to miss each other. This is an important point for understanding FitzGerald's mysticism, I think. What psychoanalysis and mysticism have in common is that they do not really abide within the world of language and its concepts. Instead, they attempt to give an account of what has been lost, what the cost is of entering language. And here I'm thinking of something that Althusser says about psychoanalysis. What has become unthinkable? How has the world of concepts produced this particular reality, organized the world, created the sense that things are so separate from each other, created the particular antagonisms that preoccupy us? Blueprint has no clear up and down. I love that in the gallery, it lies down parallel to the floor in a vitrine. It sprawls. It illustrates the field of being where language does its work, but it refuses to abide by language's laws. There is no clear place for the viewer to begin and end their reading of the text or their viewing of the image. Thus, we end with bodies careening and gliding through space that doesn't operate by familiar physical laws, even as we are firmly planted on the ground, bound by gravity. As we continue to talk this afternoon, perhaps we can discuss how practices that reorganize the relationship between reality and fantasy, and that's a line that I think is just constantly shifting from space to space and across moment to moment in history. We can think about how the relationship between reality and fantasy and how the practices practices like psychoanalysis, various mysticisms, science fiction, and fantasy writing may actually be a requirement for answering the questions that bad kinship presents us with. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I come to you from genre fiction, where a panel is a very different animal, where in fact it consists of people, usually writers, showing up with what knowledge they have on hand and talking and arguing over a topic with a moderator to prevent us from coming to fisticuffs. So the idea of presenting something that I have prepared, I always forget I'm meant to do that for panels and other parts of the university. However, I've done so. And because my training is not in art criticism, is not in visual art at all, I don't have a lot of the words for the history of something. I can point to a work of FitzGerald's and say, oh, he's referencing that particular art that some kinds of black artists in the 50s used to make. I have no idea what to call it. So I will be doing what I can. I don't even know whether I'm going to get to 20 minutes of response, but here we go. We had a working document as we were preparing for today, and there were a bunch of questions raised in the document, and I found myself focusing in on some of those. And one of them is the Bohemian life practices and underground legacies. How do we make them come alive for students? My connection to this material is through Samuel R. Delaney, a man who's writing à Revers, who was my mentor, in fact, and has become a friend. And through having read his autobiographies of the circles in which FitzGerald moved, and of having read his lovely Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, which talks about the disappearance of sexual spaces in New York for mostly gay men, but other people would find themselves there. So how do we make these life practices and underground legacies come alive for students who might see work like FitzGerald's and be uncomfortable about how he represents the black male body? And my first instinct is that the way we do it is to teach the work of its artists, the context and histories out of which they come. Simply teach them and let our students think and argue for themselves. They can't do that if they're not exposed to those realities, and that's why it's so amazing to finally show the work of someone like FitzGerald, who had so little option for having his work shown in his lifetime, to not hide him away in the basement because he represents an uncomfortable conversation. And maybe you pair an exhibition such as this one with texts such as Delaney's autobiographies or Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. One of the things I heard while I was preparing for this was that FitzGerald's work can cause uncomfortable discussions, that it troubles some people because he, a white man, was obsessed with the black male body. And though I acknowledge the deep problematics of fetishizing people based on a combination of their racial characteristics and marginalized place in society, there's a part of me that's thinking, why wouldn't he be drawn to black men? They are beautiful. And there's a core innocence that we don't get to have in that recognition that yes, there is beauty there, but there is more complicating it. I found myself asking whether racialized fetishization or fetishization of racialized bodies could exist without racism, if it is in fact dependent on the marginalization. What would it look like if there was equity? And that's one of the things that FitzGerald was wrestling with in his notes. Seems to me that FitzGerald lived in the muddy places that make us uncomfortable, the muddy places we'd like to deny, And one of those muddy places is that smushy part where sexual orientation and fetishization are hard put to differentiate themselves. I guess in talking to John, Delaney said something to the effect that everyone he knew from that circle had a fetish of some kind. So he didn't seem too bothered about whether FitzGerald did. Erotic desire is amoral. I don't mean that it doesn't care about consent. I mean that it proceeds first from a place of arousal. Our sense of what is right and proper and fair kicks in after that first flush of sexual attraction. In that way, erotic desire is apolitical, as much as we might wish it otherwise, as we might wish our desires to prove that we're good people. Art gets to examine those uncomfortable places, even to revel in them. All that said, there are a bunch of assumptions buried in trying to argue this way. One of those assumptions is that this type of fetishization is bad. Sure, fetishize feet, but not the black male body. Fetishize the smell of leather. And I think it's a way more complicated argument than that. So another question from the working document was, how do we argue for the value of past queer cultural practices that seem to not fit with our current moment? And it was really intriguing to me to the concept that in trying to put queer stories out into the world, that we're somehow essentializing ourselves, leaving out the dirty bits. That had not occurred to me because I grew up with work like Delaney's, which definitely does not do so. But how do we argue for the value of those histories? I don't know, because history, which is a bit flip. But I get impatient when institutes of knowledge confuse curation and censorship. I mean, I do grasp the dilemma. It's a very mundane one of the administration can't afford to lose its funding, because then we risk losing a whole university's worth of knowledge, and an exhibition like this one would never get seen at all. I don't know the answer. I'm not up here giving you answers. This is why I'm not an administrator. And then there's when I look at this man's work, at his writing, at his art, I do see a connection between him and William Blake. I do see the ecstatic, the ecclesiastic. And if I look at it that way, if I look at this as an expression of religious fervor, I don't see obsession with the black body. I see inclusion. So when we're thinking about how to separate, or whether we should separate the artist's life from their work, it evokes for me the Western notion that is a good idea, even a necessity for a scholar to strip away any personal connection to analysis in their field of inquiry, that we must be neutral, and that we must present the work neutrally. But in my early days as a university student, way back when, I began to notice that people's choice of field of study was almost always personal as hell. Queer studies primarily inhabited by queer students and faculty, primarily women in women's studies. The materials engineer from India who studies how to recycle the waste products of the rice-growing cultures into useful materials. Why would it be any different with creative praxis? Why might we need to pretend that the work is separate from the artist? It's impossible. How then do you study this work with any degree of distance or rationality? It's evident that our lives and our identities are closely bound up in our fields of study, So why not factor that truth in as one element of our study? To be able to confess our own biases, to be able to recognize that the thing being observed is affected by being observed, and figure that into how we think about it, rather than trying to hide and pretend we're neutral. So I find myself asking myself why I feel so protective of this work, because that was my instinctual reaction. Oddly protective of the life, the work, and art of this man I never met, partly because I see it bouncing off Delaney's life that has so many similar elements to it. Gay man married to a woman, has children, but a gay black man. So I see this reflection, and I recognize that in our queer communities, we often don't have we're embattled, we're marginalized, we're small. We don't have the luxury of huge factions. Doesn't say it doesn't happen, of course it happens. But that is one of the places you will find allies you might not expect to find. It's where you might find, I don't know, say, a black lesbian who eats for a month because a white gay man feeds her. And whatever her distrust is, there's a place where people start to speak with each other. Might you not find a measure of understanding on a personal level? Does not make racism go away. Might you find even a measure of reconciliation? Might you not develop a measure of tension, trust? It's always conditional, but it can be there. And that's what's happening in our communities that are under pressure to be disbanded from the outside. We end up having to make treat with each other more to survive. It's another of those money places. So this question of separation, or the impossibility of separation of an artist's life from their work, is one I wrestle with myself. It's why I'm no longer teaching the works of Junot Diaz or Neil Gaiman, who were friends. And I still wrestle with the anguish of, this is brilliant writing. I want to feature it in my courses. The people who wrote these works are highly, highly questionable. What do I do? And I still don't have an answer to that. I know I don't want my students to be having the discussion, having to deal with the discussion of, here are two men who preyed upon you who are still very much alive and thriving. So I put them on my bookshelf, I do not teach them. This is not the same question. This is not somebody who did harm. This is somebody who was working his way to love. And there's a final thing I want to say. He was working his way through his obsession. He was doing so through his visual art and writing. And I find myself honoring the exploration, the attempt, and ultimately his grace in sharing that battle with us. Thank you.
Okay, we thought before I or anyone else jumps in, we give everyone a chance on the panel to respond in some way to the constellation of these presentations.
Yeah, I just want to say it's extremely moving having this quality and intensity of responses to the exhibition, to the work. So often when you put things out into the world, they just kind of disappear into the ether and there isn't like a critical or collegial response. So it's extremely moving. I'm really gravitating to Nalo, your question, why do I feel so protective of the word?
Yes.
Because I feel like that was my brief or my challenge, was how to balance the respect for this artist who's no longer with us with kind of a critical gaze of now and contemporary. And I think for me, the bohemian or experimental life practices feel so, I long for them so much, and I feel like they're so far away from now that that's kind of why I tend to always be on the more celebratory or the more embracing kind of side. Is just what he and his these scenes represented in terms of living differently, living and loving differently. And so I think that's where the protection comes from, and also I guess just the not wanting to see anyone kind of thrown in the garbage or thrown out of history. And so that's where I would start with that question. But I really loved that question, and I appreciate that you felt protective about it as well.
And so appreciated that you put this together. Something I just really would not have seen that has a connection to my work, my life, and my mentors. I really loved it. I've been back twice.
And I think Delaney is able to kind of open up the work, like when you think of them in dialogue and we think of Delaney's own investments and interests, and part of the mirroring between them that I was really interested in is when Delaney and Marilyn Hackard moved to San Francisco and almost take the place of Russell and Parra had in San Francisco. And then also the science fiction novel covers that FitzGerald did for Delaney were probably the widest circulation that his artwork had, because they were on paperbacks, like hardcovers. So, and just maybe you could speak a bit more about where speculative fiction or science fiction could fit here, because I think it was an interesting terrain for FitzGerald, but it's only a small piece of the show, and I think what he knows of it came from Delaney and Hacker.
And yet there is speculation in him trying to imagine his way to better way of thinking about race. Still aware, back of my mind, still aware that he's talking black and white when there's so many races. But in the 50s, this discussion is happening in America. What was lovely for me to see was some of the originals and then the covers that got made of them, because I have some of those pulps, and how different they were. I found myself wondering how FitzGerald felt about seeing how his work was rendered, because sometimes it looked to me a bit washed out, and that some of the lovely problematic detail, just by changing the color values, had been leached away. On the other hand, it gave me instant recognition. That's what it is. I have this book. The connection to science fiction, it was a time where that would be golden age. So they were just moving, the field is just moving from what used to be slide rules, problem stories for boys with slide rules, to wrestling with issues of race, of identity, and it's just beginning to do so. And you have a man like Delaney, where his first novel, he goes to the biggest publisher in the field and is told, I don't think science fiction is ready for a Negro man yet. So I see FitzGerald probably knowing all that, probably knowing what Chip is working with, dealing with his own fascination. And I see the speculative in works like the Apollo, the one at the Apollo where the Apollo's showing through Apollo's mouth, and he sees going to those clubs, those black clubs, he sees what they're doing as being celebration and worship in a way, and is able to turn it into that in how he presents the work. So very much in keeping and in conversation. And speaking of the muddy, happening at a time where you're not seeing as much separation between science fiction and the rest of the literary world, where for a time there was no respect for science fiction, but the art world, poetry, they're all talking about this kind of way of looking at things that is outside the usual. Does that kind of get to it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Apollo painting because it's framed within Black man's mouth, and he saw it as Apollo, the god Apollo's mouth. And in the Prince of the Blues piece, which they developed as 3 sketches of, I found out quite late that the hand that's holding the whole composition was meant to be Bob Kaufman's hand. So it seems to work to me against the fetishism aspect when it's kind of the black body is almost like a frame, or the holding or kind of containing a narrative or a story. So yeah, I think that Apollo painting really ended up being central for how he thinks of kind of these that tension between being and having in a way, or incorporation.
Yeah. And one of the things that's happening now with alternative futurism is moving into the genre is people are putting themselves front and center in the stories, or putting people who aren't usually centered front and center. So if I write a Black Apollo, that's understood as the kind of bias checking that the genre does. So I can see the work that way, that he makes the mouth of the black man the Apollo. Makes me very happy.
Jamie, I really liked how you talked about what we idealize will come back to be persecutory, and I think you said putting on a pedestal, because like when we exhibit art, we typically are literally putting it on a pedestal, or there's the white cube of the gallery gives it that veneration. And so I'm just wondering if you could maybe talk a bit more about that in terms of maybe that question of how we want artists to represent like a moral, political good, but often that is not the case of the
Yeah, I mean, well, the first thing that comes to mind is actually the first time when we all met on Zoom, and one of the first things that you said, Nalo, was, well, I write genre fiction, so I don't really like have a place anywhere, and I think that that's exactly part of the issue, is like what exactly gets sort of like exalted as the art object, the privileged place where we like to find, where we do like our most serious thinking about, you know, aesthetic experience. And I think, number one, I think it's really important. That's why things like book covers are really important, and having them in galleries. Also having a photo is really important, because I think it actually forces us to ask these questions about what it means for these things to be in these spaces and to be consecrated as art in the first place. And I'm also, I think that this is like a little bit, or I guess, and so if we keep on sort of doing that consecration of art, we're just always going to run into this problem, right? Of the idealization of that which is fetishized, and the sort of like over and above the big thing that's sort of like, you know, kind of like making everyone else sort of like feel bad. So there's that. But the other, I think that this is related, is what Nalo said about grace and sharing the battle with us, like the battle with his own kind of psyche and where race is in his psyche. And I think I had mentioned to you all before that I had looked at a lot of these images with a painter friend of mine, Michael Stam, because they actually sort of reminded me a lot of his work. And he is a white, queer, figurative painter working in New York City in his 30s or 40s. And he was saying that what was so striking to him is that here is this white queer painter who is like head on dealing with the place of blackness in his culture and in his own mind, and where those two things meet, and how little he sees his own cohort of white queer figurative painters doing that work.
That's nice.
And so I think that this work is super important because it's like a place where I want artists and writers and critics to go in order to see that it's possible to do this kind of work. And I want people to look at this work and find license to actually sort of think about these things that they're really afraid to think about publicly, because, as my friend said, like, it's really weird that all of these people are doing the work of visual culture. That is their job. Like they are just solely doing their work on sort of like the plane of the visual symbolic world, and yet they are not talking about blackness. And so I think that is the grace in sharing with us. That's both what makes it so that or one of the big reasons why I think that a lot of this work sort of, didn't find a place publicly for so long. But I think that is the grace that it shares with us now, as Nalo said, that it can sort of show a kind of like next step for those who are kind of fearful to do that work.
And the next step is murky, because the first thing people do is look for the rules. How can I do this without having people be angry at me?
Mm-hmm.
Art doesn't work that way. It's the murky step we're exploring.
Yeah, I was also thinking about what I think you would call it the dirty bits. And you also, and you had also mentioned Blake, and I don't know if you could see, but while I was speaking, I was showing Blake a Blake image at the end of my talk. And one of the reasons why I wanted to show that sort of in the background is because there's like this thing about the way that bodies sort of like glide in Blake that I think seems to have influenced FitzGerald, but also because, Blake is so queer, and that was something that was definitely picked up by a lot of artists, Ginsberg, like other poets in that circle. But it really wasn't until the late 1970s that literary critics started talking about how queer this work was. And I think, and I was reading that I think it was W.J.T. Mitchell who like finally said in an essay in like 1975, like eventually we're gonna have to talk about like how many, basically like how naughty and how many like butts there are here, and I think that there comes a time where you have to sort of, it becomes difficult to not talk about the murkiness. I guess is what I'm saying.
How do we teach that?
I'm really interested in this kind of narrative that happened across, that you started with John, this Manichaean worldview, black and white in religious cosmology or mid-century American racial cosmology, literary studies, and we went kind of structure, and then the desire to kind of see a resolution of something that comes in the end in the print room, and then to a kind of deeply psychoanalytic place where these things play out very differently. But that same structure goes into that algorithm, something else comes out. to these meta questions, whether from the perspective of the pedagogue or the critic and the observation effect there. And you ended with this question that I think we've all been talking about, the different ways we discussed on Zoom and at lunch. You said, can fetishization exist in an equitable way? What would that look like? And that goes right back through this narrative differently. And I'm wondering if we can go back to that.
Yeah, when you reminded us of what Delaney had said, Nalo, I was thinking about how, what if sexuality was just organized around kinks? You know, was that the word that Delaney used, kinks? Everyone had their kinks?
Fetish.
Fetish. What if sexuality was just organized around your fetish and the particularity of that, rather than so much around the way that we organize it around like a different set of kind of coordinates of orientation.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know. Do you have thoughts about that?
And again, because I grew up being educated one way or another by reading Delaney's work, my first thought is it isn't. But he does have a way of I remember reading him once talking about straight men who hook up with gay men. And the interviewer was saying, that means they're not straight. He said, I wouldn't tell them what to call themselves. They're doing what they're doing, they're happy. I would not tell a man who says he's straight that he's not straight. And that blew my mind. And I see something similar in his comment about, everyone has fetishes. Yeah, it occurred to me today at my second look at the gallery that when I talked about fetish, I was pairing it with racism, because that's part of what energizes that particular type of fetish. What would it be if we didn't have that? I mean, I can't imagine an unracist world. I can't. But I can, in theory, get there. I could talk about it. I don't think fetishes would go away, but what would they become? What would the work of a FitzGerald, how would it be received? And perhaps with a bit more openness.
I guess I see like the political conditions of the world and racism as like the ground on which we all figure out our sexuality. And so there is something like quite, like it really was FitzGerald's project to unpack this and to really understand it. And I think sometimes, I wonder, is putting it all in a spiritual package, is that an alibi? But it feels extremely sincere and earnest, and it was really, like it would be impossible to do the exhibition without acknowledging this design, like it's so central.
Yeah.
So it's, there does seem to be something valor in kind of taking that on as a project rather than accepting the deformation by racism of one's desires as natural.
Yeah.
It's like that if you're working through your art, it's never natural. It becomes artifice and it becomes worked out through play or through different configurations and things like that. But I don't know, it's I can't really think of a lot of other people who were really that committed to trying to figure this out, especially beginning in the 1950s when there's virtually no public homoerotic representation, and the scene in San Francisco was, you could trade explicitly homoerotic work, among friends and maybe in a small gallery, but there were really not very many other places like that in the world. So just the marginalization or the how small and marginal this world was, and that they were able to have these really serious philosophical, like erotic grappling is really amazing to me.
I think we tend to have this notion that people in the past weren't as sophisticated as we were. As we are. And there it is. It's there in the writing, there in the work.
And that Delaney quote is about how identity labels and categories just fall away when faced with reality and actual desire and practices in real life.
The
But
sensitivity
don't
over
have
there.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something that you said, John, about the because the thing that strikes me about the blueprint is how incredibly ambitious it is, both like just size-wise, but also like intellectually and creatively. And there's something amazing about someone working in such a sort of small corner of the culture who has so much of that ambition and wants to make something that's basically monumental in size without having like a lot of validation from their culture. You know?
At a time of being very depressed and very reliant on alcohol and just a very dark period of his life, was still able to come out with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really know how he imagined the blueprint circulating, if it would circulate at that size, but he imagined it as something that could be like mechanically reproduced and like distributed more widely than one work. Like that's what the blueprint was for, was to create something that could multiply into the world. But yeah, I guess it's an unfinished project.
I have more questions, but I promised to open it up to the floor now. So I invite questions from the audience.
I'll just start off with a comment and saying that I really like the alignment between science fiction and queer desire. And I think there's, you talked a little bit about it, but there's a kind of worlding that's happening there, a kind of desire for a different world, a world where desire is more than two things, that it's multiple and invisible. And so I feel like in a sense I appreciate the conversation because to help me think through, because I am a fan of science fiction as a queer person, trying to understand ways that it can develop something of this moment, right? Because you've been like a lot of what you've talked about is the sophistication of FitzGerald's work back then. But that's not my question. My question is, I'm interested to know if any of you have comments on a relationship between queerness and mysticism. I'm particularly interested in that myself. I mean, obviously, it's mysticism in various forms has operated for thousands of years, but I'm wondering whether through your respective research, whether you notice any particular kind of relationship between queerness and mysticism.
Yes. So by training I'm a 19th century Americanist, and I think that during 19th century U.S. literature, and I think that the people who are doing the most sort of queer kinds of thinking are the mystics. So I think about people like Margaret Fuller, who had, she was in the kind of transcendentalist cohort and basically had like several very intensive mystical experiences before she became a writer, and wrote about them, and then wrote a pretty influential book called Woman in the 19th Century, where she basically kind of completely rethought the philosophical grounds of gender. I also think about Henry David Thoreau, who I teach a lot, who described himself as a mystic, and in his work would often ask questions like, well, why is it that it's assumed that attraction runs along the lines, or runs across the lines of gender? Why? He just would sort of say that makes no sense in his journal, and I think that kind of thinking against the normative often just kind of comes, it comes with both queerness and mysticism. So those things do, often go together in my work, and I think that's yeah, I mean, I just sort of, I see FitzGerald as a kind of inheritor of that, pretty much that same tradition of those things, kind of requiring each other in a way. That if you're going to reorganize ideology, then there has to be like a larger field where things are a lot more sort of chaotic and possible, and that has to be some sort of that has to be mystical. Like it can't abide by the rules of rational thinking and separateness and do's and don'ts.
I could just say one anecdote, which is the circle that was around Jack Spicer in San Francisco was very interested in mysticism and the occult. And Helen Adam, who features in the show, the Scottish balladeer, was another tarot expert in the group and friend of Delaney as well. But I think it was really tied to this refusal of kind of the mainstream and normative conventions. And I was just thinking that maybe mysticism is a word for religion for critical thinkers, basically, because he was so, FitzGerald was so really wrestling with all of these tenets of Catholicism that he grew up with. And I think he jumped around in terms of his beliefs because no pre-existing system allowed for his desires or for his critical thinking, and so it became this very syncretic kind of mix. And when Spicer passed away and the circle, the group kind of dissipated, so some of them went to New York and encountered Delaney and Hacker, some of them came to Vancouver and kind of laid the groundwork for the Belkin having such a great San Francisco collection. Others embraced cults and alternative religions, and you can kind of trace them embracing these alternative and experimental kinds of religious movements that were big in California in the late 60s. So it was, I feel like Spicer maybe played like a kind of guru role, and so there was a certain maybe aimlessness or the center of gravity was lost when he passed away, and so yeah. There's also a really great exhibition that some colleagues of mine curated in Los Angeles on the intersections of gay and lesbian liberation, science fiction, and mysticism in Los Angeles specifically. And it includes things like the Masonic Temple, which was closely tied to like Hollywood makeup and costume artists and backdrop painters, and also very early science fiction conventions and kind of cosplay of dressing up. And there's a catalog, and the show was supposed to come down next week, but it's being extended, I think, till February.
What's the title?
Pardon?
What's the title?
It's quite a long title. It's something like Sci-Fi Magic Queer LA. It's at the University of Southern California. So, and the catalog has really great essays. Did you have thoughts on them?
None that are coherent.
Yeah,
I had a question. Thank you for all the speakers today. But John, just one specific question to start. You mentioned this work on Saint Sebastian, and you said it was to be an opera, and he wrote the libretto, or is it a play, but it's an opera to use the music of Debussy, who wrote a work on Saint Sebastian. Was that the idea of it?
I know it was inspired by the Debussy and D'Annunzio Saint Sebastian, but I'm not sure if that was just kind of the touchstone or if he would actually use the music from it. But he wrote the full libretto and did those set design drawings, and then he was in conversation with a few theaters about showing it. And it was interesting that there was, this is 1966, and there was already, it was like kind of a shift because a more radical, like Black Power, Black liberation movement was emerging, and it was kind of think for Fitzgerald and like the other white bohemians, they found it a bit intimidating because there was not really a clear place for white kind of allies or radicals in, say, the Black Panthers or Black Power. And so for him to do this play at that time, like I'm not surprised it wasn't produced. One of the theater directors was saying, "Oh, if we do this, we'll need, we'll have to make sure that it's a Black director that does this play," and talks about how the theater company really wants to work with more politically radical members of the Black community, but that they're not trusting of white theater makers and artists. So just seeing those conversations in the '60s felt very kind of prophetic of some of the conversations now, and yeah, and so it was never produced, and we just have the libretto and the sketches.
Yeah, because in many of these works, music is this power, this force that the pieces evoke. And of course, we never hear the music. But if you know the figures who are being depicted, like Ornette Coleman and Noah Howard and all these people, so if you kind of know that music, it raises questions. And so there is this long history of the fetishization of Black music making. It runs through like minstrelsy and goes on and on. But yeah, so it's not really a question I have, it's just more an observation. I was really intrigued by having these free jazz players from the 1960s involved in these works. There's two that have Ornette. You have the drawn Ornette, and then the painting I'm still trying to figure out with Ornette as Orpheus and Billie Holiday as Eurydice that has had me going ever since I saw it. And then Noah Howard's a free jazz sax player. So it's interesting that that's the style that's being evoked. And he approaches it in a very different way than anyone else. You know, the way Ornette's music is being depicted at this time, kind of early 60s, mid 60s, is done in all sorts of ways, very ways political. Amiri Baraka has this whole idea that it's like kind of this releasing this emotional energy, and that's the whole thing that drives it. And I'm still trying to pick out the way that Fitzgerald would have understood it. I mean, the suggestion of Ornette as Orpheus is loaded beyond anything. I mean, that says it all. But yeah, so I'm just like trying, if you have any idea how he approached his music, how he understood it, and what he valued in it. I don't know if he wrote about that in his notes, diaries, or whatever. Like, what exactly about that particular type of music, which a lot of white artists had problems with. I mean, there's all sorts of like white musicians and artists who like had or confounded by what these free jazz players were doing. So I'm intrigued that one really took to it in all sorts of ways. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit the music side of it is kind of the biggest blind spot for me. Like, it's the area that really needs more attention to really come alive. I mean, the only sound in the show is when you press on the button to hear Helen Ada sing her ballad, the Cheerless Junkie song. But I mean, I'm trying to remember how much he writes about spending time with the free jazz players, but he was living on the Lower East Side and then very often up at the Apollo in Harlem. And I feel like most of the writing was about the Apollo. And one anecdote that really jumped out was that gospel shows where people were kind of in such an ecstatic state that it needed to be taken out on stretchers, and just that for him and the kind of religious traditions that he was interested in, that really resonated with him. And then also he says that what Toulouse-Lautrec was to the Comédie Française, he wanted to be to the Apollo Theatre, so that could be the documenter. But yeah, a friend told me that Noah Howard is actually quite well known, so I don't know if they were actually lovers or just kind of in the orbit. But we have the men who's friends and lovers with in New York. We have first and last names for maybe 8 of them, and then there's maybe 20 total where we have like first names. So I do really want to do more of that research.
Yeah, what's interesting is Ornette would not play at the Apollo. That's just too popular.
Yeah.
Archie Shepp once who was, no Howard play was, who's another free jazz player, once said that Burnett and I could never go to Harlem, people would just not get us there.
Wow.
So he has that line. And so what's interesting is that FitzGerald has chosen the player that he would not hear at the Apollo. It's almost like he chose Burnett because Burnett represents something that's very avant-garde, political, however you want to put it. So I didn't know if he ever referred to Burnett in his writing. Does he have writings about the music at all?
Yeah, the journalist.
I'd be curious to see what pieces singers, pieces, whatever he talks about, how he talks about them. But yeah, this is a whole new vantage point. If you look at this 60s jazz, this is very much a new vantage point that he came up with, how to view it and approach it. As I said, Ornette as Orpheus still has me going.
So was that like a downtown uptown divide, or was it more kind of
Well,
generational?
yeah, Ornette would have played more downtown, but he still had problems with venues. I mean, there's a lot of jazz musicians who are very hostile towards him. I forget, there was one, who was it? He'll come to me afterward, Max Roach, who, after he heard an Ornette play once, I think the 5 spot, he got drunk, he went to Ornette's place, started throwing stones against like the windows and just started like cursing at the top of his lungs at Ornette and just talking about how you're a joke, you're a liar, you're this and this and this. And so those players that, and Max Roach went on to write some of the most politically involved pieces of the 60s. And so it's really interesting that he chose a figure that was so divisive and he puts him in the position of Orpheus. So I'm just trying to figure out what kind of statement he's getting at with that.
Yeah. I'm not sure if he ever met Ornette Coleman, but I believe he met Louis Holidays once at parties.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Eurydice is a whole other thing, but we won't get into that.
Yeah.
Okay, but thank you very much.
Well, I was just going to make a comment about the thread of William Blake that seems to be consistent across all of the speakers, and how Blake's depictions of the angels, like their PPs are like, oh, it's kind of, it's like RuPaul tucking style, and whereas with FitzGerald, like it's a celebration, right? And I wonder how much Milton and Paradise Lost and Lucifer's experience of torment influenced. I mean, it seems to me that FitzGerald would have studied Paradise Lost quite intimately, but maybe not. And it just seems like there's so much homoeroticism in Paradise Lost, especially between Gabriel and Lucifer. And, it's like all the kind of throwing shade at one another. And if that came up much in your research.
One thing I would say about that is when he depicts himself or somebody kind of as a stand-in, it's this almost like whiter than white figure that seems maybe more like an angel figure, like the blonde figure in the tarot card. We were just talking about that earlier, and so I wonder if that is kind of drawing on the Paradise Lost kind of iconography. And yeah, that's all I have to contribute about that. Are you, Hazard Nelson?
I mean, I guess, my sense is that, again, not knowing too much about like what's in the journals or letters and everything, but my sense is that it has to do, again, with this sort of like constant attempts to get out of the dual thinking, and my instinct is that he's kind of like interested in the way that Blake picks up on the this sort of like possibility that by the end of the that by the end of the 18th century, like Satan is the hero, and it's like and everyone sort of like agrees on that, and so this sort of like flipping of the heroic, the villain becoming the hero thing, I think seems to me to be part of what he's interested in terms of like the kind of bodies, because he is like, there's something that's very much, especially in the blueprint, that seems to be about like the way that Satan moves and
feminist readings of that, where we owe all of the kind of interest in humanity as opposed to the boredom that would stay in the kind of, the boring garden to a feminine force. I don't feel, that at all, that's not there. And we haven't talked about any of the misogyny that comes up in the characters and, some of the Spicer or others, so that these uneven developments that are so clear in this multiplicity of selves, and I don't mean like a Whitman kind of grouse way, but it's it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I chose Satan exulting over Eve, because it seems like there's like this sort of flat gravity
Yeah.
thing that's like attached to femininity, and then there's this sort of like, gliding, moving, a body that can move however it wants thing that's like attached to these like really idealized masculine bodies. And so to me that was sort of like an image of Fitzgerald's Blake,
Yeah.
Yeah, Eve doesn't really pop up.
No, certainly not.
But Mary was very, like, he was him and Marian.
Yeah.
Like, Mary was very important, and then the Venus of Willendorf
So
pops up.
Yeah, but almost like